Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Edgar Dubourg. He is a PhD candidate in cognitive science at the Département d'études cognitives at the École Normale Supérieure in France. He uses insights from both the natural sciences and the humanities and both computational and experimental methods to explain the psychological foundations and cultural evolution of fictions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Edgar, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, really.
Great. So let's start perhaps with this, because I know that you try to tackle fiction from several different perspectives and frameworks, and one of them, I guess, is an evolutionary perspective. So, do we know how old fiction is in human societies?
Yes, actually no, I think we don't quite know, but it's a really great question to begin with, and maybe it would be good to start by noting why this question matters a lot. I think part of your question is like about whether to know whether fiction is part of our nature or biology, or if it is a species typical trait, and it's a fair
Mhm.
question because we in all societies where you have fiction, movies, TV series, manga, literary works, or oral stories, it seems that people enjoy them a lot. So how can we know if it is a species typical trait or an universal trait? Well, as you said, often for other cognitive or behavioral traits, uh, we we look at the history of the trait and try to evaluate when it emerged. Because if it is here for a long time, if it is here in humans, for instance, since humans emerged like 300,000 years ago approximately, then we know, at least it's first evidence that it is a species typical trait. So, and also we could also examine whether fiction is appears in different societies worldwide, or if it is present even in non-human animals, for instance. But first, it seems that to evaluate this, we need a good definition of fiction, and this is where it can get tricky, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, you need a good definition of any trait to be able to quantify its presence in, be it in different periods, as you asked, different societies, or even in different species. And here, I think it's a problem because the definition of fiction, I think, is not consensual, and it might be controversial across fields at least. Um, in my view, it has not been like properly naturalized in a way that would allow us to do such cross-cultural or temporal or cross-species analysis. So there are, I think, maybe we can start right in this question, which is I think we can differentiate between three broad definitions of fiction, and maybe at least, or maybe there are more. Um, I have not worked this through anybody, and so this is highly speculative, but let's group them.
Mhm.
Maybe the first broad definition of fiction would be the cognitive ability to make fiction in one's mind. So a
Mhm.
process some biologists or cognitivists might call simulation or imagination. So the definition of fiction here as a capacity to simulate things in our head, I think is present actually in many non-human animals. Take, for instance, a squirrel. When it wants to make a jump from one tree to another, it simulates the jump just before in order to evaluate in advance the feasibility of the action, the probability it will have to fulfill the goal it has.
Mhm.
So this is really adaptive, and here for a long time, I think, because it allows to get the benefits of trial and error without possibly failing. So it's really beneficial. Um, so it seems that we don't want to call the simulation of a jump by a squirrel a fiction. So this is where I think it's not the right definition, um, because well, it's not what we want to study here. So it seems that fiction is not just about the simulation of things that don't exist, because it's not. So another broad definition is about a bit narrower but still broad is about artistic representation. So
Mhm.
here, fiction would be a kind of representation of an individual that other individuals from the same species find attractive. And here again, it's not specific to humans. I have the example of the puffer fishes. I don't know if you know that they draw like beautiful patterns on the ocean floor, on the sand,
Mhm.
the circles, and they are specifically made because they are attractive here to the opposite sex. So what's important here is that they do that because it's attractive, and they are really beautiful. I encourage people who don't know about that to go look on the internet because it's fascinating even for us humans. So it's funny
No,
actually.
no, I actually watched that on YouTube videos and
Uh,
it's really fascinating. So yeah, if people are interested, you can find videos like that on YouTube. Yeah.
mm. And also, I don't know if you know the book of Richard Prum on the evolution of beauty, which is really about all that beauty in animals, and I recommend it to all people who listen and who are interested
Mhm.
in this question. So, if this is fiction, if those drawings on the ocean floor are fiction in a sense, then the first fiction in humans would be maybe the cave paintings around 60,000 years ago, uh, or maybe, and more likely, other productions that I don't know about that humans made and that were made because they were attractive to other people in the species. So I don't know. I'm not an expert in archaeology
Mhm.
or related fields, so I don't even know. But there might be productions even from the beginning. But in fact, I would suggest a third definition, which is more strict and which require crafting a representation while explicitly signaling to the individuals that it is not a real representation. So for such a fiction to exist, you need some sort of a pragmatic sense, as discussed in a recent paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences by Haynes and Scott Phillips. So it seems that humans are endowed with such cognitive mechanisms that allow a shared understanding, and therefore that allow for creators of fiction to make sure that what they create is recognized as a created representation.
Mhm.
Um, so according to the definition, actually it would be hard to date the first fiction. So the first written fictional story that seems overtly fictional is sometimes we say it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, but oral stories predate, of course, any written story.
Yeah.
Um, and we would also have to quantify, in fact, the extent to which, at the moment they were released, they were crafted with the intention to be rightly received as false information. So this is hard to quantify, I think, but really fascinating.
Mhm.
So
So
hard
let
to-
me ask you perhaps two or three questions about all of what you said there. So,
Mhm.
first of all, when it comes to those three definitions, in your own work, do you operate with a specific one? I mean, do you choose one of the three, or is that something that you don't really do? I mean, you study fiction, but in terms of the specific definition behind it, it's not really that important for the kind of work you do, which one is the correct
Mm.
one.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the more specific the definition, the better for any kind of work. But uh, here, I think I tend to work with the second definition, which was not the broadest, but still a bit broad, because I like to study entertainment. So anything that appeal to human's mind, uh, even if people don't realize, don't understand that it is fictional in a stricter sense. But actually, I am currently working on a project that would try to evaluate the evolution of fictionality in a stricter sense. That is the evolution of the extent to which people rightly receive information rightly receives the fiction as false information. And this is a good approximation of entertainment, actually, because if we consume works that we know are completely false, it means that I think that we want to be entertained. So we have to juggle between definition according to the project that we have, I think.
Mhm. And of course, when it comes to the evolutionary foundations of our psychology and particular cognitive mechanisms, and here we're talking about fiction, so I would imagine that it involves several different cognitive mechanisms, and we're going to get into that in a second. But one of the sources people many times point to when they have access to it to establish that a particular cognitive mechanism or a particular behavior or feature of our psychology as an evolutionary foundation or is an evolved trait is, of course, looking into other closely related or sometimes not so closely related animal models. And you mentioned there different examples, like, for example, the squirrel imagining if it jumps in a particular way, if it will reach the other branch or the other tree or something like that. But I was wondering, when you talk about that specific case, for example, is that really fiction, or are you pointing to perhaps some evolutionary precursors to the cognitive mechanisms that play a role in fiction? Because even if other animals also have imagination, I mean, imagination just by itself is not exactly the same as fiction. So, or are you really claiming that perhaps there are other animals who have fiction like uh, cognitive traits, let's say?
No,
How do you reply to that?
I, I, I really agree with the first proposition. I make a comparison with animal to show that uh, other animals have the cognitive mechanisms necessary. Some animals have some of the required mechanisms to make fiction. So it's kind of precursor, as you said, of fiction, but it's not. I really think it's not fiction. I think simulation and ostensive communication
Okay.
are all adaptations that are used by producers and consumers of fiction to be able to share fictional stories. Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, again, we'll get into the specific cognitive mechanisms, but then fiction itself wouldn't be a psychological trait. I mean, it would be like the result or a byproduct of specific evolved psychological adaptations. Is that how you look at it? Or is it by itself an adaptation?
Yeah, um, it's a great question, and I think it's still quite controversial. I don't know really where people stand on this question, but in fact, as you said, there is an adaptationist view with people who say that fiction evolved as an adaptation.
Mhm.
So it would mean that fiction uh, would have brought fitness benefits during our evolutionary history.
Uh,
It's what yeah, you're referring to. So it would amount to say that people who were interested in fiction reproduced more during our evolutionary history, and therefore, after generations, this trait of
mhm.
producing or consuming fiction would have spread in the population. And here, people, in fact, don't all agree about the possible function, adaptive function that it might fulfill if it were the case. Um, and the opposite side that you mentioned is a byproduct one, and it is
Mhm.
kind of simpler. Fiction would have no evolved function because it would be like a byproduct, a side effect of other psychological traits that emerged even before fiction appeared in humans, actually. It emerged maybe before humans even emerged. And this view has been put forward by Steven Pinker and also Leda Cosmides and John Tooby when they wrote that many features of fiction seem to take advantage of design features of the mind that were not targets of selection because they caused enjoyment of fiction, but because they solved other adaptive problems.
Mhm.
But I think there is a third path, a third possibility, which is that fiction is neither an adaptation per se, neither a byproduct,
Mhm.
because it's created by human minds. As you said, it's a result of human cognition. And I believe we need to understand why our psychology motivates us to produce and consume fiction, even if such behaviors are not adaptation per se. They might be adaptive. And this is where the work of Nicolas Baumard, my supervisor, but also Jean-Baptiste André and Pascal Boyer, and particularly one paper that they wrote together about symbolic culture, is, according to me, really important because it kind of offers this third solution, which is we can focus on the adaptive goals that such productions may indirectly fulfill. And they also show that we need to take into consideration the fitness benefits and costs of the producers and the consumers of symbolic culture separately and try to understand what would be the evolutionary advantage to produce or consume fiction. And
Mhm.
in this scenario, therefore, we could compare fiction to, for instance, a computer or a smartphone or a kayak, to take an earlier example. This is some kind of technology. That's something that humans create to fulfill some instrumental goals that would ultimately help them to fulfill adaptive goals. And
Mhm.
in this specific example of fiction, we would say that it's a kind of entertainment technology. That's what we call them with Nicolas Baumard.
Mhm. No, this actually reminds me quite a lot of the ongoing debate in the cognitive science of religion as to
Mhm.
whether religion is itself an adaptation, a byproduct of other specific adaptations, just a result of genetic drift, or the result of cultural evolution, because there's also that, and I know that you are also interested in the cultural foundations of fiction, and we'll get into that later. But one more question about what you said earlier. So, of course, another kind of source that people many times point to when talking about the evolutionary foundations of specific psychological traits is looking at ancient societies, ancient human societies. But in this particular case of fiction, I mean, I guess that there's a lot of guesswork and speculation that we have to, I mean, just deal with, because most of what we would classify as fiction, I mean, of course, we only have access to the material remains, I mean, what archaeologists basically work with. And also, there are many things that are probably lost forever because fiction also expresses itself in oral traditions, right? And that's something that just can't fossilize or be, I mean, in some sort of way, be preserved materially, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. That's really difficult. That's one reason why I don't work that much on ancient, very ancient fictional works because I'm not I don't know what we might miss, what we don't know about how these fictional stories were shared, and I'm actually very happy to work on contemporary fiction. So I have not so much to say about that actually.
Mhm.
Not
No,
much.
that's totally fair. So, but when it comes to the cognitive mechanisms
Mhm.
that you associate with fiction, you and of course other people that work on these, what do we know about its psychological foundation? So, in terms of the specific cognitive mechanisms that play a role in fiction.
Mhm. Um, we already talked about some of them, some of the skills that are the cognitive skills that are necessary to make fiction, like simulation, ostensive communication. Um, but I really think that these are not the only psychological mechanisms that we need to understand fiction. Uh, when uh, when a creator of fiction create a fiction, um, they can use the full spectrum of human preferences, and actually they are limited only by their own psychology, in fact. So it means that it's where it can get complex. It means that to understand fiction, you need to understand everything that is attractive to the human mind, and to understand that, you need to consider all possible factors, psychological factors of attraction. To take a term by Dan Sperber, so it's a big program. For instance, if you want to understand love stories, you need to understand the specificities and the variability of romantic love, which is a specific psychological mechanism that have evolved in humans for pair bonding strategy, for pair bonding as a pair bonding strategy. And you can make link between psychology of love and the appeal for love stories, which is one thing my supervisor Nicolas Baumard is working on actually. To understand why we have horror stories in the form of horror movies or literature, etc. We need a good understanding of the fear system, which is another psychological foundation of fiction, I think. Uh, and you need a good understanding of the related mechanisms like predator and aggressor detectors, which evolved in humans for to 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 avoid potentially dangerous animals and conspecifics. And here there are people at the recreational fear lab like Matthias Klazen and Colton Scrivener who work on just that. And I myself worked on the how exploratory preferences might explain the appeal for imaginary worlds, and we might talk about that a bit later. And we could go on and list a long list of psychological mechanisms that can be, and I think usually are, activated by fictional stories while we consume them. So, uh, we tried to list them in a collaborative paper that I've been working on for the past, since the beginning of my PhD, basically. And it's become a highly collaborative paper that is currently under review, but I think we will preprint it. And it's just that we try to list the psychological mechanisms that are the foundation of fiction and which combined might explain the great diversity of fictional stories, because as I started to list, we have a lot of different stories out there, and we need all of the all of our understanding of psychology of human psychology to understand, I think, fictional stories.
Mhm. Yeah, we'll come back to some of what you said there when we talk about different kinds of fiction, because there are, of course, different genres here.
Mhm.
So, but we've already touched a little bit on the functions that fictions might serve when we talked about the possibility of them or fiction in general being an evolved adaptation. But what do we know about its functions, actually? And of course, here I'm not necessarily pointing to an adaptationist perspective because it might serve certain functions that do not necessarily translate into fitness benefits or increased fitness. So, but what do we know about that?
Well, we know what the way I tend to see it is that, as I said, it's like it's kind of a technology that producers craft because they get attention from their audience.
Mhm.
Um, and capturing the attention of people might not be an adaptive goals per se, but it's a good instrumental goal to fulfill other adaptive goals. Um, and for instance, it can allow you to appear as a good cooperative partner. For instance, it can enhance how you appear competent to other people because you're good, you're a skilled storyteller. From here, I talk of the producer side. You can accumulate resources through exchange of services. Um, you can transmit fitness relevant information to your team, which is again a good adaptive goal. And I think, in fact, uh, different researchers have worked on each of these aspects, which are some kind of function that we might call instrumental function, or but not adaptive function, as you said. So there are a lot of them potentially. Like a smartphone, again, a smartphone can be used in a lot of ways, have a lot of functions, and we use it actually to communicate, to orient ourselves, to play. So it's hard to pinpoint one, and I think it's good to evaluate a bunch of them that can be relevant to explain its success.
Actually, you mentioned something there that I guess also applies to art in general, or at least the researchers who come from an evolutionary perspective apply that to art. That is that there are at least some features or specific kinds of information that many times you find in fiction that, from an evolutionary perspective, basically help communicate fitness relevant information, right? I mean, things related to survival, reproduction, and so on. We find lots of those things in fiction as well, correct?
Mhm. Yeah, I do think so, and there are studies showing that empirically that you find many information about what to eat and what not to eat, where to go and where not to go in hunter-gatherer societies. Uh, Again, since I'm actually more interested in contemporary production of fiction, I think we have less, and this is something really interesting. In fact, we have less and less relevant information the more fictional the stories are. Um, so I would tend to say that uh, again, it's an instrumental function. That is something that you can do when you capture other people's attention. You can transmit them uh, very you can transmit them very important fitness relevant information,
Mhm.
but this is not, I think, the only function fiction fulfilled. And I'm really more of broad. I think there are a broad range of possible things you can do once you get the attention of an audience. Yeah,
Mhm.
is this
By
clear?
the by the way, when it comes to the kinds of social signaling that fiction allows, I mean, do you have any idea, or is there anyone out there that suggests that fiction might have been the product of sexual selection? I mean, is that something that perhaps people of the opposite sex, or by communicating something fictionally, you might be signaling some psychological traits that are appealing to people of the opposite sex? Is there anyone out there that suggests that, or?
It has been one hypothesis. It still is. So Geoffrey Miller first started to propose this hypothesis that fiction can be used to seduce the opposite sex. And actually, there have been studies, and there are still studies about about the way producers of fiction are more appealing to the opposite sex, for instance, and it seems to be sometimes the case, and empirical studies uh, point in that direction. But then again, I would suggest that it is just one possible function uh, among broader function. And here you talked about social function more generally. I think
Mhm.
there are more generally broader social functions other than just seducing a potential mate.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, one of them that we just talked about previously was the fact that you can transmit relevant information. I mean, fitness relevant or non-fitness relevant information to other
yeah,
people, and also the other traits that you mentioned previously that you can signal to other people that might make them more open to cooperating with you, for example,
exactly,
right? I mean, it's not, of course, it's not reducible to sexual selection, if that's
exactly.
right.
You can, I think you can consider I like to talk about some specific cases, just anecdotal evidence, but where you see that reputation is important in fiction sharing. You can consider papers, for instance, that test the difference in satisfaction derived from creative production that are produced either by humans or by artificial intelligence. And if we feel such productions are different, which is what seems to appear in the empirical literature, it seems that the person behind the work is actually important enough for people not considering that it's the same thing if it's a real human behind it or not. So I think it's a good point to see that the people behind it, and also, for instance, there are another anecdotal evidence, but I don't know any study about that. But the fact that when people don't know the person that created the fiction or the piece of art, for instance, Banksy in art, or Elena Ferrante, I don't know if you know Elena Ferrante in literature, which is the person we don't know its her true identity, or
Mhm,
the Daft Punk in music, and people talk a lot about this people and are really intrigued by any piece of information that might reveal their identity. And I think it's really peculiar. We could just consume the work, but now we have to talk about the person behind them, and not knowing who they are is really something that seems to bother people. So it's all that to show that I think it seems to be at least important for people to use the production of the fiction here to infer specific traits, uh, specific psychological traits and related to cooperation, I think, to
mhm,
other people, like their reliability, their authenticity, uh, their sympathy,
mhm,
uh, or or alternatively, the other way around, to use the production, to use what we know about the people to infer, to make inferences about the production. So all
mhm,
that is related to social dynamics that are not reducible to just uh, romantic or sexual selection.
mhm.
Uh,
So I think that we've already ended up talking about these hypotheses here that I'm about to mention, or at least we refer to some of the things that people mention in these hypotheses. But just for the sake of addressing them directly, Could you tell us what the entertainment hypothesis and the information hypothesis are here?
So it's just names to try to categorize the different hypotheses that are out there. That's as we said earlier, and as we discussed it through the beginning of the discussion, there are
Mhm,
many hypotheses about what fictional stories might be good for, and I feel that it would help to organize such hypotheses into in not necessarily in two, but here I have in mind two broad uh, group the groups of hypotheses.
mhm,
The one that proposes that people can use fiction to learn relevant information, and here it would be through either simulation or communication, or more straightforward communication,
mhm,
be it about the social world, predators, our own emotional responses to specific situations, about the environment, about what to eat, what not to eat, etc. So we have a lot of things that we might learn from fiction. And there is the other side, I think, which is the entertainment hypothesis more broadly, which bring together all the ideas um, which bring together all the people who think that fiction are kind of, by definition, less informative
mhm,
than factual narratives. So there would be less relevant to bring information, to capture
mhm,
information compared to reality. They would have by definition, how do you say, a negative aspect, which is
mhm,
that it is fake. But they get the benefit of freedom. I think this is how I see it. If you allow yourself to create any story without
mhm,
the constraints of reality, or at least with less constraints from reality, you can exaggerate what you want so that the things that you're telling are more interesting to your audience. And you can therefore craft what people have called in the animal literature super stimuli, which are things that are already appealing to human minds, but that are exaggerated in a
mhm,
certain direction that makes it very appealing to human minds. And I think the more fictional the story is, the more obvious it is that it's less relevant to gather information, that we need another explanation as to why we consume them. For instance, I think of some science fiction, a science fiction writer is likely to trade the credibility of the information they deliver for its potential in terms of pleasure they provide to the audience, in terms of entertainment, in fact,
mhm,
through the invention and the exaggeration of already appealing stimuli.
mhm. Yeah, it reminds me, the entertainment hypothesis and what you mentioned there about it reminds me of Steven Pinker calling art a mental cheesecake, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly that. That's the beginning of this. I think Steven Pinker's ideas on this subject are the beginning of this uh, of this hypothesis. Yeah.
Mhm. So we've been talking a lot about the evolutionary foundations of fiction here, and of course, we have ultimate explanations, but then we also have proximate explanations and proximate mechanisms. So, do we know what are the proximate mechanisms that play a role in fiction?
Well, proximally, I think uh, it's a dopaminergic system in the brain, at least, that seems relevant because it's relevant for reward more generally in the human mind. As you said, we can also again mention Pinker, who call features of fiction pleasure buttons. So it's this proximate mechanism that can be activated to to provide pleasure to the other individuals. And as we have said already, we have a lot of proximate mechanisms that have evolved for specific reasons unrelated to fiction, I think, that can be pushed, that can be activated, triggered by fictional stories. We already talked about fear. Uh, we talked about love, about curiosity a bit.
Mhm.
So we have, in fact, a broad range of proximate mechanisms whose function are sometimes more or less, but are clear from an evolutionary point of view, and which can be triggered by fiction. Yeah. Uh, you had the specific specific things in mind when you talked about proximate mechanisms, or
No, not necessarily. I mean, in terms of the proximate mechanisms, one of the things that came to mind was basically Tinbergen's four questions, where two of them are basically about the
Mm.
ultimate explanations for behind a particular trait. In this case, we're talking about a cognitive slash psychological trait, and then the other two are about proximate explanations having to do with development and so on. But I guess that you've already answered the question. So I have another thing that I would like to ask you about that I also read about in your work. That is imaginary worlds in fictional stories. So what are imaginary worlds exactly?
that the first part of my PhD, the first project that I did when I arrived in the Evolution and Social Cognition Lab at the INS in Paris, we
Yeah.
worked with Nicolas Baumard on imaginary worlds, and we define imaginary worlds as the settings, the kind of settings in fictional stories that are different from the real world, from real environments that we know in the real world. So you can think of a red line in One Piece, for instance. You can think of Hogwarts in Harry Potter. You can think of the universe the broad universe and all the planets in Star Wars. Uh, Westeros in Game of Thrones, Arda in Lord of the Rings. Anyway, we have a lot of examples, of contemporary examples that are actually really, really successful. That's what's one thing that that brought me to this subject at first, is that I realized that all the fiction that personally I liked first, but also that seemed to be liked like by a bunch of people around the world even. So these are all the first world fiction that are really released in almost all countries. And
Mhm.
what is specific to all these works is that there are places that don't exist in the real world and that are perceptually or epistemically different from the real world. So one key determinant, I think, of the definition that we propose is about the background knowledge that is required to understand more broadly the fictional story. So imagine because imaginary environments are the fictional environments that the recipients of the fiction could not have possibly explored in real life because they actually uh, come from the mind of one individual, which is the creator of the imaginary world. And actually, it gives also rise to some fun culture-specific, culture-related behaviors and motivations. For instance, you can think of how fans like and enjoy creating fandoms that is online, online encyclopedias about the world, which are highly structured with a lot of information. And that's something really interesting from a psychological point of view, I think.
No, yeah, that's right. I'm aware of some of those online fandoms. And by the way, let me just tell the audience that if you're not familiar with One Piece, you should become familiar with it because actually it's the second most sold comic in history.
Uh,
just behind Superman. It's already past the 500 million volumes sold, so you should definitely get into it before it's too late.
exactly.
So, but I guess we'll might come back to One Piece later. So,
That makes me think of we talked about social just to parenthesis, we talked about social functions before. That makes me think about the one thing that I like to think about the social function of fiction is the opportunity cost of not consuming something that is really spread out there. I think of some friends who didn't watch Game of Thrones, and while the episodes were released, they were really they felt left out actually, and there is really a cost of not being interested, I think, in popular fiction because you miss good opportunities to bond actually. So
yeah.
funny about One Piece, how we can recommend it because it is popular.
Yeah, right. But do we have any idea where this fascination for imaginary worlds come from? I mean, I guess that in a sense, part of the answer is already there in what you said, the social bonding and so on. But I mean, at first sight, it seems a bit weird because we're talking about non-existing things that are many times probably not relevant at all to how we live our lives, to our real world. So, where does it come from?
Yeah, exactly. First, I think the social functions are relevant just to explain how we use fictions when we have consume them and like them and enjoy consuming them. But I don't think it explains the pleasure we have from consuming them. I think it's like a thing you can do afterward. I think we need specific psychological explanations of each of the features in fiction that we find attractive. And in fact, this is what we worked on with Nicolas Baumard in two papers, in one theoretical and one more empirical. And we propose that imaginary worlds are appealing because they meet the input conditions of our cognitive disposition geared toward exploration. Just as romance and tragedies, for instance, meet the input conditions of our preference for love or enjoyment of competition. And here I build on first on cultural attraction theory by Dan Sperber, but also of one paper that I consider really important, like kind of seminal in this field, which is Daniel Nettles' paper in 2004, The Wheel of Fire and the Mating Mind. Um, so which is about linking the appeal of some specific features in fiction and psychological dispositions.
Mhm.
And our hypothesis, therefore, is that imaginary world, our appeal for imaginary worlds rely on our exploratory preferences, driving us to, motivating us to explore new environments in the real world. And in fact, this comes from intuitions from some creators of imaginary worlds themselves. I like to quote Tolkien first, who wrote in a letter that part of the attraction of Lord of the Rings relies on the same feeling you get when you're viewing far off. I think it's the towers of a distant city. So you want to explore it. You see the towers, you want to explore it. And Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Zelda, who said he wanted to create a game world that conveyed the same feeling you get when you arrive in a new city for the first time. So both captured the same intuition that I think is really relevant here, which is about you want to explore the world, you want to know what is going on, how it is organized, what are the opportunities in this environment, etc. So our hypothesis, which relies on these intuitions, is equivalent to saying that imaginary worlds constitute a super stimulus of explorable real-world environments. Or
Mhm.
that, to take again Sperberian terms, uh, that imaginary worlds are part of the actual domain of the cognitive mechanism that evaluates the learning opportunities in landscapes, in environments, as opposed to the proper domain, which is about which is constituted of the real stimuli that triggers this mechanism. So here, cues of real-world explorable environments.
Mhm. So I would imagine then that when it comes to these exploratory preferences, there would be inter-individual differences in them, right? I mean, there are probably people that are more prone to exploratory behavior than others, correct?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, uh, all inter-individual differences in people's preferences and behaviors, I think is a matter of trade-off that are dealt with differently at the level of the individual, according to many factors, in fact. So this is a hard question, the one that we try to elucidate, of course, but difficult. So here, the relevant trade-off, the most relevant trade-off has even a name, which is the exploration exploitation trade-off.
Mhm.
So it means why and where should organisms uh, decide to explore or not to explore, that is to exploit. Uh, because lots of animals have exploratory preferences, have to go beyond what they know, have to go into unknown territories. So in our paper, we argue that sources of adaptive variability explain the interindividual differences in people motivation to explore the real world and therefore imaginary worlds. And we
Mhm.
therefore predict that exploratory preferences and the preference for imaginary world would co-vary uh, simply. And we actually provided evidence for that in two studies with correlations between measures of curiosity or openness or facets of openness and the reported preference for fictional stories
Mhm.
set in imaginary worlds. Those that develop a full imaginary world.
Mhm.
But we also predict that factors of attraction that explain the variability in exploratory preferences in the real world should explain the preference for imaginary worlds. And here, for instance, there seem to be a universal and adaptative source of variability in development. There is evidence from experimental and developmental psychology that shows that children explore more than adults in a lot of tasks and other kind of measurements. Um, and this is consistent with evolutionary theory, which proposes that this is a big exploration is more adaptive to children because children have more to learn from the world. And there is another reason, according to me, which is that in humans, like in many animals and many, especially mammals, there is parental investment, uh, meaning that parents transfer resources to children, and therefore children can afford to explore without even if they don't find if they don't discover anything valuable right now, they can afford to lose some resources or time because they have transfer from their parents. So we can afford to to explore more because we are a species with parental investment. And I think this can explain, for instance, why we see many fictional stories for children set in such imaginary worlds, such as you can think of Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland, of Neverland in Peter Pan, uh, of Coco, Up. Uh, I don't know how you, Onward. I think all Disney movies, basically,
Mhm.
almost all Disney movies are set in a world that is different from the real world, and it's really
Mhm.
striking. And we also talk about all other sources of variability in the preference for imaginary worlds, then we can consider, for instance, also the ecology. So in humans, much like in other animals, you have a variability in the preference for exploration that is explained by the environment because this mechanism is very plastic, meaning that organisms have evolved in a way to calibrate this preference for exploration,
Mhm.
uh, this propensity to explore, to characteristics of the environment. Notably in harsh environments, exploration is very risky because if you don't find anything, you you lose what you have not found. You discover nothing, so it's risky and it's costly because when you are doing that, you're not exploiting your resources that you can exploit. So when you delay the collection of a resource to go explore, you lose the benefits of that you would have generated if you were exploiting. So this is the opportunity cost.
Mhm.
Um, so with this whole rationale, we explain the why we try to propose an explanation as to why imaginary worlds are increasing in modern societies. They are increasing, I think, in number as a share of literary works or movies that are set in imaginary worlds increase relative to the whole production, but they also seem to increase in size or depth or complexity, let's say,
Mhm.
as they include more and more information that allows to better grasp the world in itself. And we are actually working on a project that tries to study just that. That is the evolution of the size of imaginary worlds, for instance, from islands to continents to planets to entire universes. Now we have universes with bunch of planets, and makes me think of No Man's Sky, the video games where you have even computer generated computationally generated planets, which
Mhm.
see the in as you explore, so you get to explore an infinite universe,
Yeah.
basically.
No, no, and I guess that also very much manifests in like for example a Song of Ice and Fire and One Piece. I mean these are massive worlds. Even
Mhm.
if it's just one planet, it's really massive and extremely detailed. But I mean when it comes to that, do you already have any hypotheses on the table to potentially explain why there's been that expansion in terms of the number of imaginary worlds we have now in our culture and so on?
Yeah, it's the explanation. The explanation would be that since this mechanism is plastic to resource availability, if you have more
Mhm.
resources available around you, you can afford to be more explorative because you risk less and you have more benefits. Also, you have more benefits because the information you get from exploration is actually valuable in the future. So you need a long time horizon to think that it's valuable to explore. You need to think that the information you will get will be valuable for a long time. So your time horizon kind of mediate the kind of determinate the importance the value that you that you get that you think is the information. So basically, because of all that, um, um, you can explain the emergence and rise of imaginary worlds with the increase in resources in modern societies. You can get a proxy, which is just an approximation of some other measures that would be also relevant to explain how people feel safe about the amount of resources that they have in their environments. But one proxy, which is more simple to measure, is GDP, which rise in every modern, developed, industrialized societies, which are the societies in which you have a lot of imaginary worlds that are being created and more of them. So the explanation that we propose with Nicolas Baumard is that the the changes in the ecology, in our ecology, which are really manifest in the last decades or centuries, can explain the changes in the popularity of imaginary worlds.
Mhm.
This, uh,
No, yeah, it makes sense. And I have a couple of follow-up questions to all of what you just said there. So, I would imagine, I hope this is a fair question because I'm not sure if you are very much into personality psychology or not, but since we're talking about an individual trait here, I just wanted to ask you this. So, do you have any idea if a preference for exploratory behavior would correlate with particular personality traits, like, for example, in the Big Five, openness to experience or extroversion, for example? Do you have any idea about that?
yeah, we actually in our empirical paper we tested that specifically. We tested that both with um, a big data set of of personality traits that are associated with specific movies. Like you had a data set that was released with 3.5 million people who liked some movies on internet, on Facebook, and their personality traits. And we have an aggregated data set of this, and we used the random forest algorithm to detect which of these movies are set in an imaginary world. So we
Uh-huh.
tried to had to specify which to find to select which movies are actually set in such a world, and we did correlation, and we found that we had predicted and found that people who enjoy these worlds are higher in openness to experience, which is as you predicted, huh, and which is a measure which can be thought of as a measure of curiosity, of individual levels of curiosity, and it's actually negatively correlated with extraversion. So this is another something that we didn't expect, but that we didn't predict. We just wanted to look the at the the openness trait, which
Mhm.
I think is the most relevant here. And we replicated that with an experiment, so correlation with people who were being asked the Big Five, and they had to report their own preference for fictional stories in imaginary worlds, and we found the same correlation. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm really interested in this in the associations between certain uh, big five traits, let's say personality traits, but we talk about the big five here, and
Mhm.
the liking and enjoyment of specific fictional stories. And I think it's really really important to do that, to try to better understand fictional stories. We need to understand why some people like them, but some people don't, actually.
Yeah. And I guess that in terms of, let's say, real life behavior in industrialized and post-industrial societies, apart from people that score higher in exploratory behavior being more prone to liking this sort of fiction, that would also, in terms of their real life behavior, these would also be people that, for example, would also like to travel more, live in different places, experience or try different kinds of food and different kinds of things out there, right?
Exactly. This is exactly the kind of prediction that we would make. In fact, the whole cluster of behaviors that are associated with openness to experience should be associated with the consumption of imaginary worlds. So we have we could make all the predictions that you have just made, and try to test them one after the other with the limit or the risk that uh, we might expect that the consumption of imaginary world could be could replace some other activities that people high in openness to experience would have performed before there were imaginary worlds in the landscape. I talk here of a kind of substitution effect, where people who would be high in exploration would should read, for instance, travel literature or historical or novels or
Mhm.
but in fact, if there is something that like imaginary worlds which are super stimuli of this, we should expect that in fact they should stop consuming that for imaginary worlds. So this is where it's beginning to be tricky to make prediction because we we still expect people who like imaginary worlds to travel more, but they should travel less if they consume more imaginary worlds, you know what I
Mhm.
mean?
No, yeah. So in that particular case, if you're right, then some people, at least after they start reading a Game of Thrones, would prefer that to then just historical novels or even history books, because probably the life of Daenerys Targaryen is more interesting than Charlemagne or Alexander the Great.
The hypothesis, exactly. And our time is limited. It's a budget that's the whole thing behind trade-offs, and we have limited budget of time, so we need to allocate the time in the manners that we find the more relevant. And here, Daenerys is, I think, a good example of a super stimulus.
So, I mean, these inter-individual differences would then also explain, according to your hypothesis, why certain people love, for example, in terms of genres, fantasy stories and science fiction, and other people not that much, right?
In terms of genres, you mean of the genres of people?
No, the genres, the fictional genres out there. I mean,
Oh,
I
fiction
was
genre.
referring here to specifically fantasy stories and science fiction.
Yeah, but science fiction and fantasy are the kind of works where there are imaginary worlds.
Mhm,
Uh, I think of actually I think of genres are as folk categories, like categories that people make because
mhm,
it's efficient to navigate bookstores and streaming
mhm.
platforms. It's categories that are really useful. And I do think that we predict the same inter-individual differences in the preference for specific features and the preference for genres where these features are predominant. So just to make it clear,
Mhm.
in the paper that I've been referring to at the beginning of our discussion, the paper that lists many mechanisms and many features of fiction that are associated to them,
Yeah.
we call such features in fiction that tap into specific cognitive mechanism ingredients. And it's kind of a metaphor. And I prefer to stay at this level of analysis of ingredients, of specific features
Mhm,
uh, that trigger cognitive, psychological mechanisms, and not to broad genres. And again, we choose this analogy because it's a good analogy, I think, because to understand which recipes people enjoy in cuisine, you'd better understand which ingredients they like and why, and not the whole recipe, because you lose some information. For instance,
mhm.
I like to take some example in movies. For instance, if you think of why people like Harry Potter, if you take the information that it's just a fantasy book, you lose a lot of information about other ingredients. Notably, one major ingredient I think is the investigation that is developed in all the books. The first book is even kind of whodunit. You have to know who it is. But
Yeah.
Harry Potter is never categorized as a detective book or a detective movie. And you lose a lot of information while not trying to disentangle all the specific parts in this fiction that are activating many psychological preferences. So that's the kind of uh, I think the research I'm trying to do, the research projects I'm trying to develop, uh, is a kind of should is a kind of refutation of genres as a category that is useful in research, at least, because we lose too much information. Yeah.
Mhm. No, no, I get it, I get it. But with that framework in mind, when it comes to specific features or specific cognitive mechanisms that would play a role in evaluating different kinds of stories, do you think that you would be able to have a better understanding of why, for example, according to the features of the stories, certain people would tend to prefer, let's say, love stories and others horror stories and so on?
Yeah, I think so.
Mhm,
I think we would have to. So there is a whole empirical research program that should be associated with this framework and with this idea, which has already started, and we just try to bring together this framework. But people at the Recreational Fear Lab are already working on inter-individual differences in the preference for horror, for instance. Huh? And there are a lot of papers being released like every week or every month about that. But this is the idea. The idea is that if you better understand specific ingredients, and their amount or their importance in a given story, you
mhm,
can better understand why who you who would like this fictional story and why. And this is where you need a good operationalization of each ingredient. You need to be able to measure them in a quantitative way. And this is where we try to propose methods to do that with Valentin Touzeau, Nicolas Baumard, so my collaborators at the moment of all these projects, huh, where we try to propose ways to measure ingredients in fiction so as to be able to list all the ingredients that are important in a given fiction and try to make predictions based on that. That's
mhm.
the idea. Mm.
Mhm. No, no, I get it. I get it. I understand that the way we use genres or classify different fictional stories in terms of genres. I mean, they are very broad and many times ambiguous categories that might include many different features that might apply in a story and not in other. And for example, you might have a crime story that also includes love elements and horror elements, and I mean any other kind of let's say mix of ingredients, right?
It's kind of the same the same how do you say a step that did the personality researchers when they went from a perspective, trying to put people in boxes, you
Hmm.
you to dimensional approach where you instead you associate with each individual multiple dimension, and therefore you have an infinite, not an infinite, but a very, very, very broad combination of different traits. And here I think it's a good comparison. We try to go from genres, which are categories in which you put movies, to a lot of dimensions. Ingredients are each ingredient is a dimension where people score high or low, and you can therefore have a practically infinite combination of ingredients, which is really more subtle and I think more will be more predictive and more interesting to study them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that also when it comes to the structure of personality traits, then it's not only the trait, but you also have the facet and so on. Like in the big five, I mean, two facets for each trait and so on and
Mhm.
so forth. I mean, you can break it down into finer or, I mean, into finer details, right?
Yeah, exactly. That would be the idea. We could really go. That's the direction, and I hope that it will get some results, and that we can continue in this direction. But I'm really hopeful about this direction.
Mhm. So we've talked here a lot about inter-individual differences. What about cross-cultural differences? Are you also interested in that? And are there lots of cross-cultural differences that we know of in terms of fiction preferences, and so on?
Yeah, there are cross-cultural differences, cross-society differences, and we started to tackle that when we talked about adaptive variability and the preferences of specific fictional features
Mhm,
according to local ecologies. Behavioral ecology is about trying to find how changes in ecological factors explain changes in behaviors. So, of course, there is one kind of explanation, and if, in fact, before I started to work in cognitive science, I used to believe that cross-cultural differences were due to a combination of slightly different starting points and a kind of past dependence due to our, our evolution through social transmission and
mhm,
small changes. But I think this explanation, in fact, I've come to learn that doesn't explain why within the same country and within sometimes the same group of people from the same country, from the same society, you also find variations that are often comparable to those between countries and cultures. So this doesn't seem to fit the data at the individual level. So I think we need to um, to to acknowledge the correspondence between inter-individual differences and across country differences. And so now I believe that in fact such cross-cultural differences can mostly be explained by differences in ecological conditions, be it resource availability, I don't know, climate or pathogen prevalence or sex ratio. You have a lot of things that vary between countries actually, and that we know have a causal effect on our psychology. So I think by acknowledging this past, you can at the end, following our framework, at the end, try to understand why there are differences between countries in what they enjoy as fictional stories and what they produce. Uh, so I think this is a direction that I try to investigate in my projects, notably on imaginary worlds, that the cross society differences in the preference for such fiction can in fact be explained by differences in ecological factors.
mhm. And those ecological factors would play a role in the specific content as well that is part of the fictional stories, right? I mean, perhaps there are certain features of the particular ecology that people live in that would also manifest in the content of their own fictional stories, right?
Yeah. Here I meant imaginary worlds in our strict sense. That means the setting of the world
Mhm,
that is different from the real world. But yeah, there are a lot of, as I said, we use the term ingredients. There are a lot of different ingredients in different
mhm,
stories when you consider cross-cultural patterns. And and people can enjoy all stories for very different reasons, and therefore you need to understand how ecological characteristics influence each psychological mechanisms that might be responsible for the liking of each specific ingredient. So it's becoming to be in our collaborative paper, the one I mentioned at the beginning, and then a bit later, we try to associate each mechanism with um, some sources of adaptive variability that have been demonstrated in the literature or proposed at least. And therefore, it makes a lot of prediction about what kind of ingredients are liked in which ecologies. And
Mhm.
this is a research program that I think which we should continue to validate this framework.
Mhm. Okay, so I have one final question, and actually, this is probably the most important question of our interview here today. So, who is the better character, Sanji or Zoro?
I was beginning to be stressed about the beginning of the question and
Now, you know that is
oh,
the
obviously,
most debated question among the One Piece community. So,
I think you can actually try to propose we can actually try to propose an answer according to the inter-individual differences in personality of One Piece fans. They will not like the same characters because they have not the same preference for some specific characteristics of people they like to cooperate with, and we could list all the mechanisms that are related to uh, people evaluation, like trustworthiness, competence, etc., and try to find which corresponds to which. This is a really good research program.
okay, but I want an answer here. Sanji or Zoro? Come on.
I prefer Zoro.
Yeah, I'm on your side. So I guess that now I can say that I have academic support to my preference. So
Cool.
okay, so Edgar, look, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, well, I have a website which is www.edgardubourg, so my first name, last name, or you can find me on Twitter, and I have all my publications on my website. So I think that's it, huh? Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving links to it to that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real fun conversation, and I hope to have you back on the show when you finish your PhD. So
With great pleasure, and we can come back to this debate, to the last debate.
yeah. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters. Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Igni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.